There's just something nice about talking about fake geography. It's scratching the itch that made me want to become a history teacher without having to actually deal with children or the school's administration, and no, I'm not sure which of the two I'd rather deal with less. Speaking of geography though, the Warhammer world. It's like Earth, but if someone sneezed every time they tried to draw a coastline. While the Holy Roman Empire of Man is the protagonist of the setting, it's also quite small in the grand scheme of things. Cathay is huge, the Tomb Kings have half a continent to themselves, and quite frankly, it's nothing compared to the non-human factions. If we were including the underground when discussing how much territory people control, the entire planet would technically be under Skaven borders, except for Athel, Loren, and Ulthuan. But on that topic, there's a third elven faction that's still the owner of plenty of territory itself, the Dark Elves. Home to such classy things as banners made out of people's skin and the slave trade, their chief holding of Naggaroth makes for quite the contrast to the Empire of Man. Whereas the Empire has places that are quite nice to live in even by our standards, there's not a square inch of Druchii territory that you could feasibly want to live in for one reason or another. So let's talk about this dumpster fire of a continent, because I want to talk about the lines on a map and elves at the same time, and this is the perfect chance to do it. But while Naggaroth itself is a bit of a dump, the Dark Elves still know how to have fun there, and if you too would like to enjoy yourself a bit, look no further than Adam and Eve, the sponsor of this video. Adam and Eve makes only the finest of adult toys ever seen by this planet, but more than just quality, they've also got quantity. There's almost 1,400 options for you to choose from. That means that if for optimal viewing pleasure, you purchase their fine toys at an equal ratio to the amount of videos I've put out, you'd be buying 6 of them for every video of mine you watch. That is a whole lot of lovin' right there. But while I can assure you of the quality all day long, you're no doubt a savvy customer who would like some further assurances. Well, fear not, Adam and Eve already starts you off with 24/7 customer service for any issues you may have. And better yet, they promise not only a 90-day return policy, but discreet shipping as well. There's no shame in wanting to keep your personal business as private as possible, and Adam and Eve make sure no one but you knows what's giving you a good time when your order arrives. And to make sure you feel good morally as well as physically, 20% of Adam and Eve's profits go to fighting the spread of HIV worldwide. That sounds like a cause to celebrate, and with them doing this for over 50 years, you know their word is good. If all this makes you want to treat yourself, then I've got just the thing. Go to adamandeve.com and use code Pancreas for 50% off one item, free shipping to the US and Canada, and free rush processing. That's adamandeve.com and code Pancreas for 50% off one item, free shipping in the US and Canada, and free rush processing. Some exclusions apply. You should never feel bad about feeling good, so get yourself something special from Adam and Eve and enjoy yourself however you can. Now then, let's discuss the best places to get a cloak made out of human skin. Before we start, there's a question I think I should answer before we go into this. You'll notice as we go on that Naggaroth really sucks, and you might find yourself wondering, why do the Dark Elves still live here? The answer is that they didn't really have a choice. Any Druchii would happily live on Ulthuan if given the chance, they just aren't allowed the opportunity before the High Elves riddle them with arrows and spells. When Malekith and Morathi tried to take the Phoenix Crown and then later changed that plan to ending the world, they failed and were forced out of Ulthuan. As they fled, they went to Naggaroth, since it's quite close to Ulthuan and there wasn't too much in the way of things living on it. Relatively speaking anyways, the Lizardmen aren't far away in Lustria, the continent has more than its fair share of monsters on it, and depending on the lore you're reading, there were also some human tribes in the area. Emphasis on were, because for a brief thought experiment, imagine what happened to Native Americans in our own world. Now imagine if Christopher Columbus was a Dark Elf from Warhammer, and you can probably picture what happens from there on your own. The name itself is already a good sign of what you're gonna find. Translated into a language not spoken by people who, if you're lucky, will kill you before turning you into a battle standard, Naggaroth means the land of chill. If you've played Total Warhammer, then you already knew that, because a solid 70% of it is a cold biome. Temperatures range from barely ever so slightly above freezing during the height of summer to freeze to death in minutes at their worst. Anyone caught unprepared wouldn't even make it to one of the Dark Elf megacities. Not that you'd want to go there, but every now and again the High Elves do land on the continent to attack the Dark Elves, so it does happen. I'd still say it's not quite as cold as Kislev though, at least not as cold as when the Tsarina decides Grimgor's entire army needs to be frozen solid. There are a few geographical locations and features worth considering outside of the megacities, the most obvious ones I'll go through now. Through the center of the continent runs the Black Spine Mountains, and as another heads up, yes, everything is named like this. If it isn't named like this, it's named in elf language, so pick your poison between edgy and elven. Within these mountains does not lie much in the way of Dark Elf settlements with the notable exception of the Shades. These are Dark Elves that act as scouts for their armies and guard both the mountains as well as the Underworld Sea, which we'll get to soon. Aside from them, there is the occasional outpost, but nothing too grandiose. Within them does lay a large amount of monsters though. Dragons and giants in particular make their homes here as they have since before the elves came around, and beyond that, plenty of creatures that can be found in dark elf armies like manticores and harpies also lay claim to the region. And beastmen, of course. As is tradition for the Warhammer world, this is a place largely untouched by civilization, and therefore there are beastmen everywhere. When chaos rises in power, and an ever-chosen tries to take down the world again, they'll get agitated and start attacking the dark elves, but otherwise they largely do their own thing. The northern portion of this range, called the Iron Mountains, borders much of the dark elven cities, and accounts for a large amount of the materials they need on a day-to-day basis, for everything from weapons and armor to more creative devices. Going further south of these regions, you have places with names like Venomglade, the Broken Land, and the Sulphur River. Here the soil of Naggaroth is ever so slightly less barren and terrible, which the Dark Elves naturally use to turn this region into their breadbasket. Though in function much of the region is equivalent to the American Midwest, that is to say nothing but corn for miles and miles on end, geographically it's more equivalent to central, southern, and southeastern Canada. Vast pine forests will sprout here to give Dark Elves access to lumber, and Beastmen a more fitting home to shit and piss all over. Massive plantations of slaves dot the land to provide the Druchii with the food they need to sustain their primary cities farther north, and such is the brutality of these places that slaves are worked till they drop, where their bodies then fertilize the soil. And no, you are not imagining it. It is in fact into the southern regions of the faction primarily located in North America that the slave plantations are found. Very clever, GW. While in the east, the Dark Elves make their homes and make misery on anyone who happens to stumble across them, to the west we have some rather less explored regions, which is a shame because on a map they look cool as hell. On Naggaroth proper, there's a large amount of desert in this land, and given the continent it's located on, I feel it's safe to presume it's a miserable desert at that. No oasis here, unless it's an oasis of blood. The Plain of Dogs might make you think that ain't too bad, but again, this is the Dark Elf homeland. If it's called that for a literal reason, and not because someone insulted someone else by calling them a dog and the name stuck for the landscape, it's probably full of hellhounds. Same for the Plain of Spiders, although I would certainly hope you don't need me to explain why that place sucks. If Total Warhammer is anything to go by, you can occasionally find Ketep wandering around this place looking for ways to bring the Tomb Kings proper back to life. Probably less canon that one though. Most likely it's just done to give the Dark Elf something to fight other than the Skaven, the occasional Chaos Worshipper, and other Dark Elves. Going further east, and technically leaving the continent, you come across this so aesthetically pleasing batch of islands all over the place, with various names like the Glass Isles, the Broken Lands, and Rumbling Island. The inspiration looks to be the earliest maps of California, which for those of you unaware, initial explorers of the region thought California was an island. In universe, a massive earthquake racked the region in ancient times and split the land like this. Between this mishmash of islands and Naggaroth proper is the Boiling Sea, so named because the constant underwater volcanic activity causes the ocean to literally boil in certain places there. Even the Dark Elves rarely venture into this body of water, and when they do, it's almost always using black arcs, and their only purpose here is to capture some of the fearsome monsters that make their home here to use as war beasts. Since we're talking about the sea right now, a key place to know is the Underworld Ocean. Across this map of Naggaroth from 8th edition, you can find places labeled as a gate to the Underworld Sea. Rather than these being access points to an ocean in the afterlife, the name is actually quite literal. It's a sea under the world. Once these routes were discovered, the Dark Elves soon realized they could use them to access the Boiling Sea, and from there the Far Sea and beyond. Where they once had to be content with merely being able to raid Ulthuan and the Lizardmen, now nowhere in the world was safe from their reach. Interestingly, while the Dark Elves have access to reliable routes across Naggaroth, the vast majority of the cave networks down here remain unmapped. There's even mention made of how there's more and more evidence every year that not only was there a lost civilization down there once upon a time, but there still is. If you'll allow me to speculate a bit, given that it's a hidden ocean with a hidden society somewhere down there, maybe GW is planning on bringing the Iden and the Deepkin to fantasy once upon a time. That's pure speculation though. From the few passages about this place, I didn't see any specific mention of it being elves down there. It was just Dark Elf shades discovering evidence that there's civilization. Up next are the southern regions. Naturally, as you go farther south, the land becomes more fertile and warm, since it is, after all, closer to the jungle home of the Lizardmen. In spite of the first part, the Dark Elves don't have much in the way of any permanent settlement down there, which if I had to guess is for two main reasons. The first is that the Lizardmen rarely make any serious efforts to invade the Dark Elves to the north. Plenty of skirmishing parties, but in terms of proper military campaigns, there's little going on. The second reason I would wager is that there's still the mentality of going home that they cling to. Ulthuan belongs rightfully to the Druchii and not their pathetic Asur cousins, and so they might not have much down here because it'd almost be like admitting defeat. Going down where it's warm and setting up shop means admitting you were driven out permanently, and now you have to make do. Both of these, again, are largely speculation on my part, though. And it could just be the fact that after 10,000 years, they prefer the cold now, not the jungle. There's still some plantations and whatnot down here too, of course, just no major cities like up north. There is a city named Siljator marked on the map, which is an elvish name, though, so there is some small amount of dark elf habitation to be taken note of. To wrap us off with the generalities and get into some of the specifics, let's get into some of the small, non-Druchii places of interest in the region. First up is the place known as the Petrified Forest. You know how in Dark Souls 1's opening cinematic it talks about how the dragons lived in an endless landscape of nothing but giant, craggy trees that are perpetually in grayscale? That. The Petrified Forest is a silent and barren landscape where trees that either appear to be or are made of stone cover the landscape, and the land has been covered in ash for as long as anyone knows. The occasional ravine will break up the landscape, but aside from that, there's nothing. No animals, no habitation, not even any wind. It's just empty. Keeping with the Dark Souls comparison, it's like in 3 after you wake up the Egg Lady. Miles and miles of barren, ash-covered nothing. Anyone who ventures near the area feels almost suffocated by a pervading sense of evil. No one even knows why the place is like it, but in the oldest archives of the Library of Hoeth, there's some small mention of a battle between great powers during the Elven race's infancy. My guess would be this was a spot where the dragons and Old Ones fought when the Old Ones first started terraforming, maybe even featuring the Dragon Emperor himself. That would absolutely be a retroactive explanation though, since I'm largely using the 8th edition army book for this video, and Cathay's big ol' rework came well after the end times. There's also the High Elf colony of Arnheim, or rather for a while there was the High Elf colony of Arnheim. Protected by mountains and swamps, this was the Asur's chief foothold on the continent, although eventually Malekith himself led an assault on the place and obliterated it. In Total Warhammer though, it was where Alethanar set up shop for a while before he moved to piss on Malekith's doorstep in 3, so perhaps some Asur attempts to reclaim it still happen every now and again. A little bit to the north of that, at least in the Total Warhammer continuity of things, is the Witchwood. It's where Ariel's twin sidekicks hang around, beating up beastmen and dark elves before Malekith and or Grombrindle eventually get enough steam going and turn their precious fancy tree into kindling. And for a final miscellaneous location of interest that isn't strictly speaking all about the Druchii, the ancient city of Quintex. While it is on the 8th edition map, there's not actually much about it. At least in Total Warhammer though, it contains the ruins of an ancient city from before even the elves, which either means Old Ones or some other random civilization that the Old Ones wiped out when they started terraforming. All sorts of goodies can be found there to be researched, and in the Total War games, Morathi has set up shop to turn it into a research base / sex dungeon. Now then, time for the cities proper amongst the Dark Elves. Several of them have towers in them of great significance, and much like the Empire, there's no better place to start than the capital city, Naggarond. Just changed Roth to Rond for this one, so not the most creative of names, but they make up for it with how creative the brutality gets. This is, by the way, Fantasy's version of mixing up the Iron Hands and the Iron Warriors. Naggarond, the city of chill. It's both the oldest and most sprawling of the Dark Elf megacities on the continent, and indeed, as you'll come to see shortly, is really 2 cities in one. It is outright called the most malevolent place in the entire Warhammer world. This is a world where a portal to actual hell is a geographical location that anyone can walk to, and this is somehow worse. Welcome to the Dark Elves, folks. Just like their equivalents in space, they spend their off time trying to actively one-up chaos itself for being the evilest bastards in the setting. Surrounding the city are pure black walls 100 feet high, with wrought iron gates at 4 different locations around them, each 50 feet high. To really complement the aesthetic of this city being Barad-dûr, visitors can take in the sights of the banners of the Witch King blowing in the breeze, most of which are painted on the skin of people sacrificed to Cain. I'm not just running a joke into the ground when I keep referencing them skinning people, they keep doing it. Don't worry though, because among the Dark Elves' many sins, failing to recycle isn't one of them. Body parts and skeletons also litter the outer walls, sometimes set upon spears, sometimes placed on the spikes that make up about 50% of their architecture, and sometimes just smeared on the walls. Once you're inside the city, it gets even messier. Depending on where you're at, this is either literal or metaphorical. If Malekith's resounding losing streak of invading Ulthuan didn't tip you off, planning isn't the Dark Elves' strong suit, so walking down any given street, you can expect to find everything from barracks to slave pits to gladiator pits to noble mansions. Don't forget the temples of Cain either, because those are some of the most key parts of any Dark Elf city. Well, yes, they're of course where the worship of the chief god happens, they also serve a far more practical purpose by doubling as degloving factories for all the skin capes. Not helping this is the fact that within the confines of this city, murder is working overtime as both a religious practice as well as a way to pass a lazy Sunday afternoon. Cain doesn't care if the person you murder is a high-ranking Dark Elf admiral or some random bozo from the street. As long as murder is happening, he's happy. If you see someone walking down Naggarond streets without a care in the world, they're either a complete idiot or capable of cutting you down before you have time to blink. You may wonder why Malekith allows his capital city to be such a mess both design-wise and with such blatant slaughter happening below his feet. That's because he doesn't allow it. He encourages it. As long as it doesn't interfere with his plans, he wants this. If things get a bit too chummy, he'll start encouraging slave revolts and feuds between nobles just so things get a bit more violent. Those strong enough to survive navigating and interacting with this city will serve him better, and the weak who couldn't handle it no longer taint his presence. So yes, Naggarond resembles a hive city, but for once in the history of those places, that's on purpose. And really, who's gonna stop him or complain? His mother, who's also a freak? His chief god, who's the god of murder? Or the people of Naggarond, who have the chance to benefit from the constant power plays? To hell with all that, if you died in Naggarond, it's because you were weak, and you sure as hell won't be mourned. Don't forget the constant smog, by the way, that's here too. It's not from industry or anything, that would be very un-elven. It's from all the sacrifice people burning to death. I don't know how many people you would need to have constantly roasting alive to make the sky look like California traffic, but I think it's safe to say it's a lot. At the center of the city is the Black Tower, also known as the Tower of Cold. This is where the two cities part comes in, because it's so goddamn massive it is a whole other city within Naggarond. For the mundane stuff, which very conveniently doubles as the stuff with little actual lore, it's also a complete mess, and yes, this is still on purpose. The only difference is instead of sometimes running across mansions mixed in with the commoners' houses, now everything is a mansion. Aside from that, same deal. There's barracks, walls, ramparts, and more scattered all over the place. The only real difference in the outer layers of it are the income brackets and that the prostitutes are called escorts. Don't worry, there's still human skin everywhere here too. At the very center of even this lies the true central bastion of the Black Tower. This is personally owned by Malekith, and if you aren't a member of the Black Guard of Naggarond whose entire job is to guard the damn thing, then you only enter if he allows you to. Upon entering, you'll notice that it's both almost pitch black and the walls are covered in cobwebs. Turns out after getting flash fried by a Surian, Malekith got a little bit uncomfortable around flames, so the only light is the occasional glowing glyph. As for the cobwebs and poorly maintained decorations, Malekith originally wanted his new house to surpass even the finest of palaces on Ulthuan. Then between bouts of depression, rage, and general angst, he stopped caring about that. Once the central tower was a place of constant revelry and hedonism. Now only the top is maintained and covered in stolen treasures from across the world. The rest of it is filled with moldy tapestries and other depressing sights of glories gone by. At the top is the council chambers with Malekith's iron throne at the head of the table, which he only sometimes sits in during meetings because he likes to walk around while everyone's talking to psych people out. The table is made out of pure obsidian, while the chairs are made out of, say it with me now everyone, bones and flayed skin. There's 100 in total, but some of them are always occupied. By corpses, of course, some of which are so ancient they're mummies, and others of which still have maggots writhing about them. There's even rumors that one of them was once especially close to Malekith himself, perhaps being a brother or even a son. Either of these things would have the potential for tremendous lore shakeups if their story didn't start and end with them being set dressing for Malekith's conference room. He talks to them, by the way, the corpses. No one knows if he's actually speaking with the dead or just doing it to psych people out more, but if nothing else, it's very successful on that second front. At the very tippy top are Malekith's personal rooms, where he has a magical scrying chamber that lets him look out at any place in the world at any time. One can only wonder how often he pulls a Joseph Joestar with it. The Black Guard also have their quarters within the walls of the city, and each of them have a near infinite amount of slaves to attend to them whenever they want. They do, however, constantly practice drills and prepare for war, because Malekith only wants the best for them. Places they hang out are largely avoided even by the rest of their kin, because they tend to kill anyone on the spot if they don't feel you've shown them due reverence. So that's Naggarond, the chief city, and I feel it suitably sets up the tone for the Dark Elves. How do the rest of the cities follow? Look no further than Ghrond and the Tower of Prophecy. Where Malekith holds court in Naggarond, this is Morathi's playground. It's actually shaped almost identically to Naggarond, but Malekith would be damned if the whole world didn't know his burnt penis was the biggest one around, so Ghrond is a fair bit smaller. It's a fair ways north of Naggarond, which as a consequence means it's approaching the danger zone of the Warhammer world. You know how supposedly if your thumb can cover a nuclear blast, you're safe from the fallout? Well, when it comes to how far it is from the Chaos Wastes, that's about Naggarond's distance. Ghrond is a bit too close. The snowstorms of the region blow into and from the realm of chaos, and from her tower, Morathi gazes into the mysteries of change that swirl through the region with every snowflake, hoping to gaze power and knowledge for her own schemes. Sure enough, some of the main roles in Ghrond are either as a diviner of fortune, or as a messenger to Malekith to let him know about foretold events. The finest of the Dark Elf sorceresses can be found here, training and furthering their magical power both for their master's whims as well as their own schemes. For Morathi's part, she supports her son's rule without question, but supporting and accepting are different things. Morathi is every bit the power-hungry despot herself, and she'd happily be in charge, but Malekith doesn't mind her little rebellions, as long as the tribute continues to flow from her playpen. It does, and generously so, which is why he doesn't care about her grumbling about her whippersnapper son being in charge instead of her. For the city of Ghrond itself, it can be divided 3 different ways. We'll start with the inner, prettier one first. By no means is it nice, mind you, it just looks a bit prettier. Before the blood orgy starts, anyways. This is where Ghrond gets its reputation as a city of total decadence, because it's the party that only stops when everyone is dead. Literally. A near non-stop party where anything goes, and I mean anything. Whatever sinful, hedonistic act you want to partake in, Ghrond provides in spades. But the real fun stuff happens at Morathi's own personal holdings in the inner sanctums. Getting access to this place requires being handpicked by Morathi in some way, either being a member of her court on some level, or being a man she gave specific allowance to enter. On the one hand, you've entered the one part of Ghrond that doesn't have near constant violence. On the other hand, you've entered Morathi's personal sex dungeon that has a survival rate of just her. Not even the demonettes that get summoned to her parties make it out unscathed, so really determining how awful it is entirely depends on how much of a hedonist you are. Would you trade the most mind-blowing sex for eternal damnation at the hands of summoned demons? If so, it's worth it. If not, it's not worth it. Around there, we get to what I like to call everywhere else in Ghrond. With all the winds of magic blowing from the north, the constant use of magic to scry fate and summon demons, as well as being close to the Chaos Wastes, it's a never-ending battle. Dark Elves are constantly fighting off demons, warriors of chaos, beastmen, and anything else that crawls out of the literal hellhole to the north. But no one complains. No one cares about that, at least not for long. Because when your shift is over, you get to party till you drop. That in Morathi is just so hot, you guys, and I promise on my life that isn't just me saying that for once. It is in the army book specifically mentioned that her beauty is part of the reason troops can still be found willing to fight for this place. An army of simps is all it takes to defend a place so under assault by demons it might as well be submerged into the realm of chaos itself. Slay, Queen. Then you get down to the third part of Ghrond, the mines. There's so much gold, gems, and more down there that if it weren't for everyone being afraid to death of Malekith, Morathi could have bought the loyalty of everyone in Naggaroth 10 times over. Not Naggarond the city, Naggaroth the continent. It's also part of why this place gets reinforcements, as well as why Malekith allows his mom's bullshit. She can kill a few of his nobles if it means he gets enough gold to make Mansa Musa feel inadequate. Aside from being especially prosperous though, they're really just mines. Almost entirely worked by slaves, and yes, you can assume there's flayed skin everywhere. Morathi's still a Druchii after all. The next major city is Karond Kar, and the Tower of Despair. This is by far the easternmost Dark Elf city, and borders the Sea of Chill on a fairly large island instead of being on Naggaroth's mainland. Consequently, it's also the city most seen by outsiders. Not because it's a trading hub, although in many ways it is for other Dark Elves. No, it's seen by outsiders because it's also known as Slaver's Gate. When the Black Arcs and other fleets of the Dark Elves return from pillaging the outer world, they stop here to drop off their cargo and make what fortune they can. The weather, though not perhaps as chaotic as up in Ghrond, is constantly miserable. I know the Dark Elves live in the Americas, but Karond Kar has the worst UK weather imaginable. It's always raining, and it's that awful kind of rain where it's just warm enough to not be snow, so it feels a million times as cold as snow because you get soaked immediately. The wind is a small hurricane on a good day, and every now and again a tidal wave just happens. Naturally, or as a result of Mythlon, it doesn't matter. Sometimes the ocean comes to you here. Because it's situated on the peninsula of an island, there's no escaping once you're taken here. Aside from the fact that dark elves will brutally kill you if you try to escape, even those that manage to slip away from their captors find that they have to swim in freezing waters to get away from the city itself. Given that they're starved, beaten, and naked on the way to the city, no one has ever had the energy to make the swim and live. Naturally, the dark elves have plenty of horrible things in store for them, and fun fact, whenever a fleet sails in to unload slaves, any dark elves that are walking by the docks will stop what they're doing and throw rocks at them. They find it funny. Sometimes they'll even send their servants in to incite a panic and try and get some crowd crush going, which makes them cheer even harder despite the fact they're losing out on slaves. This place is the worst. Beyond that, it's the usual mishmash of buildings everywhere, with the central focus of course being slave markets. The richest dark elves will have their manors overlook the markets and ports so they know when the reavers have brought in a good haul. Screaming slaves and screaming sacrifices are part and parcel of everyday life in the city, and there's even wide-scale necromancy at a small level. Not quite proper Warhammer necromancy, but the sorceresses of this city love to attach the souls of dead slaves back to their bodies, so their never-ending screams of torment can haunt their dreams and really liven up the atmosphere of the city. Turns out even death isn't the end of dark elf slavery. What fun! The city for the wealthy is fairly opulent, with the people who do the actual trading with the slaves staying home most of the time to enjoy their nice mansions. If there's a nice haul though, they'll leave their manors and the auctions begin. A captured high elf is the most valuable prize, but a large enough mass of humans will still get the bidding wars going. Negotiations are suitably cutthroat, although surprisingly this isn't literal for once. While the Black Arcs and other slavers have the slaves, if they want profit, they need to pawn them off, and the traders of Karond Kar know damn well they have the power there. Most Dark Elf captains will find that their haul isn't quite matching up to their expectations, although once again, and in spite of expectations, this rarely if ever turns violent. As it turns out, Karond Kar is home to no small amount of assassins that are on the traders' payroll, and I think the army book itself puts it best. Better to leave Karond Kar with a light purse, they reckon, than to never leave it at all. There's been a lot less of this talk compared to the Empire of Man video, but economically speaking, I'd say that Karond Kar is the most stable of the Dark Elf cities in the most fucked up way possible. Gold rises and falls in value and is subject to economic inflation like anything else, but the Dark Elves are always happy to have more slaves, for mundane reasons or sacrificial ones. Or worse purposes, I won't say, for monetization reasons. With the Dark Elf economy heavily relying on slavery, expect Karond Kar to be a fixture of the economy for centuries to come. Following up that lovely place is Har Ganeth, and I'm gonna need you to stay with me on this one. Picture the Dark Elves as I've been talking about them. Insane, hedonistic, cruel, every city they have is a free-for-all for all of whatever sick shit you can think of. But what if I told you that this city, outright called the City of Executioners for its devotion to the god of murder, is actually an orderly and lawful place? I promise it's true, I'm not making that up. There really isn't too much to the city in a lot of ways, but its special sauce is especially gruesome. It's ruled by Crone Lebaron, one of the highest-ranking Dark Elves, and in the eyes of Cain, second only to Morathi. Her word is absolute law, and unlike in Ghrond, where if Morathi isn't actively looking, you can probably get away with whatever, you will be following her rules here. She doesn't follow them, but that's the wonderful thing about being the person in charge, isn't it? When you make the rules, you can break them whenever you want. In Har Ganeth, you will not randomly murder people in the street, even if they're slaves. Those are someone else's property, after all. You will not steal, you will not order assassinations on your neighbor, you will not litter, you will not fail to so much as look both ways before crossing the street, because if you do, then there's only one punishment awaiting anyone who's broken a law: being dragged up to the altar of Cain and being sacrificed. This has resulted in Har Ganeth being the most lawful city in all of Naggaroth. While there is plenty of politicking still to be found, the Dark Elves here have had to become more subtle with it. Instead of ordering someone else to be killed, here the locals instead try to make the other person break the law in some way and then get caught. Because the only punishment for all crimes is death, it's not even like the elves here are trying to get the other person framed in some grand conspiracy. They can just go, "Hey Lebaron, that guy parked for 16 minutes in the spot that says 15 minutes or less. That's all it takes." So the people here have learned to be very careful. For the most part, their schemes will stretch decades, if not centuries, just to get a rival eliminated, and this is the constant Cold War the city is in. You can petition Lebaron for a pardon from a crime, but that's a very risky affair. You're walking up to the person who has decreed no crimes ever and asking to either get away with a crime or for forgiveness from a crime. If the answer from her is no, you die. What purpose does this oddly puritanical attitude serve? Well, aside from the fact that a society not based on Starscream is more productive than one that is, it's in service of Death Night. For most of Naggaroth, Death Night is a holiday almost exclusively celebrated by witch elves. They go around breaking into people's homes and killing them for Cain, to which everyone else responds by barricading their homes and praying witch elves don't break into their house. But in Har Ganeth, everyone gets in on the fun. During the day before Death Night, the gates of the city are barred and all the prisoners and slaves are let loose. Everyone in the city waits with bated breath for sunset, and when it comes, all hell breaks loose. On this one night, the laws are to be completely ignored, and the city turns into the most violent, blood-fueled madhouse you'll ever see. Having been forced to not be completely psychotic for an entire year, the Dark Elves of the city let loose everything they've pent up all at once. Death Night already is insanity, but in Har Ganeth it's taken to a whole other level. Come sunrise, everyone hurriedly bolts back to their houses, because anyone who's left standing in the streets is picked up by the witch elves and, you guessed it, sacrificed to Cain. Most of the witch elves are noted as preferring to bathe in the blood of the innocent, which has to mean slaves, because no dark elves after Death Night qualify, but Lebaron herself only does it with those who've embraced the insanity of the holiday. And for a brief time after this holiday, Lebaron is rejuvenated. She's called a crone because she usually looks old as hell, but after Death Night she's once again the beautiful elf psycho she was in her prime. As a small fun fact, the High Elves once invaded this place with the greatest army that had ever assaulted Dark Elf territory. The aftermath of that battle is them refusing to even name the place. I'll let you piece together how it went for them all by yourself. The takeaway here is that if you have to go to a Dark Elf city, go to Har Ganeth. Just make sure to keep up to date on your calendar so you know when to leave. The second to last city is Hag Graef, the Dark Crag. While the Dark Elves and Dark Eldar share plenty of similarities, it's arguably in Hag Graef where they're most embodied. First off, the city is a complete mess. If Naggarond is a hive city, then Hag Graef is Kamara. Architecture outright described as impossible makes up the place, with rival nobles having their most fortified bastions and personal quarters 5 feet from each other, leading to all sorts of fun slaughter happening on a regular basis. Built entirely at the bottom of a valley and surrounded by mountains, no sunlight has ever reached this damned place. The entire place is run by 8 families, each of which control one of 8 huge towers between which walkways stretch to connect them, some of which are so massive they could constitute a city in their own right. This is indeed where most of the citizens live, and it's such a mess that the random violence of the Dark Elves is only exasperated. Walking between walkways with anything but the utmost of caution and armaments means some random Druchii drug addict will come flying out of the shadows and shank you before they move on to the next victim. What keeps this mess together is the mines that provide the city and the Dark Elves as a whole with iron for weapons and endless wealth for its coffers, which incidentally, yes, the Dark Elves have 2 super mining towns. The difference, of course, being that in Ghrond, most of the wealth is first spent on Morathi's pleasure parties, whereas in Hag Graef, it's spent on much more mundane means. Mundane in the Dark Elf sense anyways, which means it's funding more skin cloaks. This is the city that is apparently the most dreaded by slaves, because it's a guaranteed sentence of endless mining and mining and mining until you drop. And even then, your body will keep mining, because warpstone can also be found beneath the city, which animates your body to keep at it until you crumble into dust. Aside from being Darkwing's personal hell, Hag Graef also has the largest armies of all the Dark Elves. The constant wealth means that they're well equipped, and the fact that the city is such a shithole even for Naggaroth means that unlike everywhere else on the continent, there's no need to send out press gangs to force Druchii into the army. Here, the people join willingly, if only so they don't have to spend another second in Hag Graef. It's even noted that if the 8 families ruling the city combine forces, they can almost certainly overthrow Malekith, who in turn has spent no small amount of effort ensuring they're divided, so that never happens. Aside from joining the army, nobles in the city can look forward to attempting to claim the title of First Dreadlord. The position gives one the power to set the city's tariffs and take a huge cut of all profits it receives, meaning every wannabe noble is gunning for it at all times. People there consider the appointment of a new one the next round of an eternal game of oddball, because the moment someone gets the position, everyone starts hiring their assassins, of which there is an exceptional amount in this city. The constant assassination is so bad that despite having the largest amount of assassins per capita, Hag Graef's canine assassins will likely have over 100 different people buying their services in a single year. A year is actually about 400 days in the fantasy world, but that's still a different dude hiring you to kill someone every 4 days. As you might also expect, every single First Dreadlord in this city thinks that they're the ones who are going to be too cunning and powerful to be taken down by their rivals. If you like what I think Hag Graef is like on a day-to-day basis, it's night city. 8 families taking the place of corpos, assassins are hit teams, and whenever an elf finally snaps and start rampaging through crowds of slaves and Druchii alike, nicely slots into being the cyber psycho of the town. Hell, given the fact there's warpstone aplenty and the Skaven that naturally attracts, I'm sure there's been plenty of actual cyber psychos in this place. And our final city is Clar Karond, a city that for some reason I find the name of just incredibly fun to say. It rolls right off the tongue. This is another city with a tower in the name, the Tower of Doom. Much like most cities in the Empire, Clar Karond is surrounded by mass amounts of forest. Consequently, it has become the premier shipyard for the Dark Elves, making it likely the second most sustainable city in the entirety of Naggaroth behind Karond Kar. If you want slaves, you need ships to capture and transport them, so Clar Karond is safe in its position in Dark Elf society. It isn't top dog like Naggaroth, nor the up-and-coming rival like Hag Graef, but its economy will always be reliably churning along. Fun fact, the Dark Elves have apparently driven off everything alive in the forests around the city other than the slaves they used to cut it down. Isn't that fun? That's a fun fact, come on, that's fun. Once again, we come to a very hive-world-like city, though in this case it's even less planned. Because the Dark Elves don't care much for sustainable foresting, every few years the city massively expands as they cut down more trees. New fortifications and towers spring up all over the place atop the ruins of residential and commercial buildings, and sometimes an entire district will just be forgotten about. It's very Imperium-esque. Aside from the shipping, the city's other noticeable specialty are its beastmasters. If you want monsters, you come to Clar Karond, because they have them all. Hydras, manticores, dragons. If it's in the Dark Elf army list, and probably beyond even that, you can find and buy it here for a hefty price. As is fitting for the monster city, it pays particular tribute to Anath, the evil goddess of the hunt. When they go to war, it's to the cries of both monsters and savage hunters alike. There was also once a 7th city called Har Ganeth. It was a particularly strong fortress settlement even by Dark Elf standards, but at some point it apparently got a little bit too rebellious. And you know how in background lore, the higher tier Warhammer wizards can casually do things like evaporate an entire city with a flick of their wrist? Well, Malekith did the 2-finger thing Nappa did when he and Vegeta landed on Earth, and now there's just a crater in its outermost walls left. Rest in piss, Har Ganeth. Now we're largely wrapped up here, but there are a few things of Dark Elf construction of importance to the geography of Naggaroth left to talk about. As mentioned during Ghrond's segment, much of the Dark Elves' territory is perilously close to the northern Chaos Wastes. While to the west and east there's not really much but ocean, and to the south the Lizardmen are rarely a problem, to the north the Marauders of Chaos are a constant threat. And quite frankly, they're the least worrisome thing. For all I've called Malekith an idiot several times, he knows damn well his northern border better be secure, lest 4 different gods obliterate his land. So the Dark Elves constructed the Watchtowers, which is the most underselling name I've ever heard in Warhammer. It'd be like saying Big E is stronger than your average psyker. It's not a lie, but it's kinda underselling it, don't you think? Each of these is no mere outpost for information gathering, but a citadel with fortifications to withstand years of sieging and supplies to keep thousands stationed there at once. The largest can be found on the map of the continent, and all across the northern lands, the Dark Elves have set up countless other different walls, citadels, supply depots, and more. There is no vast distance or ocean separating them from chaos. They don't have a Kislev equivalent to soft automatic Everchosens like the Empire does. It's just them and the constant threat of demons. So while the Dark Elves are absolutely horrific, in this they deserve some small amount of credit. While the nations of men in the old world do suffer from chaos, that ebbs and flows. In Naggaroth, the Druchii hold the line against a horde without an end in sight, and for all their horrible deeds, they do it well. Give some small thanks to Malekith. Him and his country of assholes provide a nice brick wall for chaos to bash its head in against, to make it just a little bit easier on the rest of the world. For some final miscellaneous things, there's the Altar of Ultimate Darkness, which, you know, there's not much lore on, but I'm sure you can get a feeling for what it's like. There's the Anvil of Vol Settlement, because even the Dark Elves need their forges to be good in quality, and Malekith's armor was actually made by a renegade smith of Vol way back when. Surprisingly, the guy was rewarded handsomely by Malekith with no strings attached, and he used his wealth to make a big old fortress. Then Morathi had him killed anyways. And even if it's only in Total War campaigns, there's one brave orc out there giving the Dark Elves hell, fighting on in the name of all slaves to earn his green people their freedom. Fight on, Sporticus. You're one of the greats. And that is Naggaroth. It's cold, it's miserable, and the people in it are the last ones you'd ever want to meet. Unfortunately, and as always end times notwithstanding, it and its bastard inhabitants are likely to remain a permanent fixture in the world for centuries to come. Maybe you can repulse the Dark Elves when they raid your turf, but taking the fight to them is a wonderful way to get turned into a skin coat. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the skin cloak to my Dark Elves, something that really spices up this channel in all its horrendous glory. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching, and take care out there. Yeah, I'd line up outside of Ghrond waiting to get pegged. What about it?